Okay, well, I want to thank Jim Sable for his support of the museum in Moclips and the comments about my model. It's very nice to hear that from such an experienced modeler. I also should introduce my wife, Judy, who's sitting behind me here in the picture. This was the Northern Pacific Station as it appeared in Moclips, Washington, shortly after it was opened. It opened in 1906, and it's a belief that this photo was taken in 1908. In any case, it's an interesting station. It was a standard Northern Pacific third-class two-story combination depot. The covered waiting area, as far as I can determine, was unique. I don't believe that occurred anyplace else. Moclips is over here on the far side of the Olympic Peninsula. It's about 20 miles out of Hoquiam and 15 miles north of Ocean Shores, two places that you may know more a little bit, maybe a little more familiar. Moclips is a very sleepy village these days, but it was more prosperous in the early 20th century. Well, the story begins when we acquired a condo in Moclips. Judy and I acquired a condo in Moclips in 2005. And fortuitously, that was the year that Moclips was celebrating its centennial. The programming for that centennial taught us a lot about the history of the area, and especially about the railroad's interesting historical influence. As I said, in 1906, Northern Pacific opened its most western station in Moclips. They brought many tourists and served shingle mills and canneries. I'm going to show you some old images from the Museum of the North Beach that Jim Sable mentioned. These are pretty dramatic, I think. This, for example, is a picture of a typical, I guess, typical weekend crowd in the early 20th century. These people all got off the train, and because the roads weren't very good, there are probably 10 times as many people in this photo as there are now living in Moclips. Fill the hotels and play on the beach. This hotel had approximately 300 rooms, was destroyed by fire or storm 2 or 3 times and rebuilt. But I think its total history was probably less than 10 years. And notice the way they dressed on the beach in the early 20th century. There was also even places to shop in Moclips. This was on Pacific Beach, which at that time was the main street. This is a contemporary photo of Pacific Avenue. And the photo here down in the corner is a contemporary photo of the same area. Just vacation homes, basically. The railroad also served the shingle mills and canneries. This is an old photo of the largest shingle mill in the area, the Smith Shingle Mill. And the Moclips River was lined by canneries at that time. There is one vestige of a cannery still existing there. This photo, I think, is about a year old, and I've noticed in the last few months that the building is collapsing into another stage even beyond this level. Anyway, based on all the information we learned from the museum and on the photos, I decided that my layout at that time in the planning stages would be built around Moclips with a shingle industry and canneries, and that I must include a replica of the Moclips station, even though it's a pretty large footprint for my little, my layout's about 160 square feet in ON 30. So it's not a large layout. But I also wanted to help the museum by building a replica of this 1906 station because they are pointing toward rebuilding the station on a new location. So my layout's in 1/4 inch scale. I'm building the museum's 1906 replica. I was able to acquire the original plans, including a materials list. The materials list turned out to be very useful for finding the exact dimensions of windows and some trim and that sort of thing. There was a Dempster diving story. I don't know the details of that, but anyway, the museum had original plans and I was able to get a copy of them. And they were very useful. I usually have worked with wood, but I decided to try styrene for the model. And my only previous experience with styrene was this little cabin that's on my layout. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of photos about the construction itself. These are some of the photos that I have available. I cut all the parts from evergreen novelty siding. The 0.10 inch novelty siding happened to correspond quite closely to the dimensions of the siding on the station, the prototype. And I added view blocks. I didn't plan an interior for the station, but I added view blocks and extra bracing to make it sturdy. I don't know how many of you have used one of these nibblers, but it turns out to be very useful for cutting openings in styrene models. It looks like a pliers, more or less, but it's got this anvil arrangement. So you can clip out little chips and make openings in styrene quite nicely. The platform I built on strip wood on a MDF base, and the paint was just mixed with my spouse's advice to get color as close as we could to the color in the colorized photo. Of course, the colorized photo is a little arbitrary about color anyway, but and then these cleats were added simply because as a museum model, I wasn't sure how this might be securely attached to a base. I needed to fabricate the windows and doors because there weren't any commercial ones that were quite the right size. I have a handout that I've used for other clinics about windows and doors. If you'd like to have a copy, let me know. This is my email address, and I can send you a copy. The windows were double hung windows, and that's the kind where the lower sash slides up behind the upper sash, and they're really pretty simple conceptually. There's a frame represented by the dotted lines here, and then trim around the outside, a sill, and these Munton first floor windows were tall, narrow windows with 4 panes. So they had the Muntons. The upper floor windows were 2-pane windows with no Muntons. These are the dimensions I actually used for styrene material. The main thing I want to point out is that I used material that was actually a scale 1.5 inch thick rather than 3/4 of an inch or 1 inch thick, because it was easier to work with, and commercial castings typically are about that much oversized. These are the steps I went through with the window, with the first story windows. I made a jig by making a drawing. I used a computer to make the drawings. You could do it with a pencil and paper, and then surrounding the edges with strip wood. The strip wood is sized so that the framing material is just barely proud of the strip wood. So the frame is assembled inside the strip wood, and then the trim is applied to the edges of the frame, and the strip wood helps support it. The sash assembly gave me a lot of grief figuring out what I was going to do, but when I finally figured it out, it was pretty straightforward. The first layer of sash just covers both the lower and upper sash. And then the second layer just lays on top of the upper sash. This is shown on cross section down here, where the bottom line, the bottom structure is the layer 1. Layer 2 goes on the upper side, and then the glass, I use glass, but the glazing goes in next. And then layer 3 is actually on 2 different levels, here on the upper sash and down here on the lower sash. I hope that is fairly clear. As I said, I use glass in this model for the glazing because it does have a better a more realistic appearance. In many other models, I've used various kinds of plastic, and they work fine too. So the next step then is to install the layers 1 and 2 of the sash. Then you paint it. You have to paint it before you put the glazing in, or you'll have a mess. To install the glazing, whether it's glass or plastic, I really like liquid PSA. I don't know if how many of you have tried that, but it's like a contact cement, but it has probably relatively little strength. It dries in just a minute or two into a sticky substance, and it stays sticky after it's dry. So you don't get the squeeze out around the edge of glazing. After I've put in layers 1 and 2 and then painted and glazed the thing, then I add the sash layer 3 and the muntins, and that finishes the window. The same steps happen for the 2-pane windows, but there are no muntins. So you just make a jig, assemble a frame, sill, and trim, add the first 2 sash layers, paint, then install the glass, and add the pre-painted 3rd sash layer. Pretty straightforward. It could be done with wood, incidentally, I'm sure, but the precision dimensions of styrene make it fairly easy. This station had a bay window, and I used the same general techniques for constructing the bay and the windows. Then for the passenger doors, I used an analogous approach. There are more parts to a passenger door, but the approach is very similar, and actually the process is a little easier. People don't have to mess around with glass or glazing, except if you include a transom. And I use materials of similar dimensions. So I use the base dimension of 1 1.5 inch, even though in this case, I could have used it much smaller. By the way, O scale is really convenient to work in because 20 thousandths of an inch is almost exactly an inch. 20 thousandths thick piece of styrene, very close to an inch thick. The main things here are that the door includes, in addition to the frame and all that sort of thing, there's an upper rail, a middle rail, a lower rail, and some raised panels. So here again, I made a jig, computer drawings, and strip wood lining the outside. Then I assembled the frame in that jig. I added a panel for the door, and I used 40 thousandths styrene sheet for the panel just because that's what I had. You could use almost anything. Then I added the rails and the stiles, the raised panels to the door. And then I put some glazing behind the transom, painted the whole thing. Actually, I painted it first and then put in the glazing. And then I added the knob. This little note here is just to remind me that I wanted to mention I had found that these little lace pins I found at Joann's, and the knobs on these pins, the heads on these pins are exactly 3 inches in the O scale, and so they're perfect doorknobs. And so I made the doorknobs by just using one of these pins and a little piece of paper or styrene, I can't remember which, painted with brass paint. The freight doors are also pretty similar. I guess the main functional difference is that I use scribed styrene for the door panel and then trimmed it appropriately. So I made a drawing on my computer, put it on a firm piece of backing, surrounded it with strip wood, and then build up the basic door frame, and then assembled and painted the external door, and then added trim above. This is an early photo showing all of the windows and doors installed. I had not intended any indoor interior detail in this model, but I did think that with the bay window so exposed, there needed to be something going on in the bay window. So I put in a little desktop and a pencil holder and a telegraph key. The corbels were the next issue, and they are numerous. There are a lot of them, and they are ornate. you can see from this drawing of the original prototype. And they're visible because almost anywhere you look at the model, you're going to see some of these things. They're structurally important because the roof is constructed with two different pitches, and the corbels are required to give it that form. I needed to figure out how to do the corbels. What I decided to do was, again, to make them of styrene. A very simplified design. I wanted to kind of capture the spirit of the original, but I didn't intend to capture all the ornateness. Rather, I wanted to get some of the basic curves and certainly all the main dimensions correct. This I achieved by fabricating them from strip styrene, and I used a 3-part jig, which I'll show you in a moment. And these Forstner drill bits. Now, I happen to be a woodworker, and so I have a drill press, and that makes it possible to use these Forstner bits. If you didn't have a drill press, this probably wouldn't be very useful. I don't think you can manage Forstner bits with a hand drill, but the point of Forstner bits is that they allow you to drill out a part of a circle rather than, or a part of a hole rather than an entire hole. So I could use them to do these curves. So I made this 3-part jig, and the first part was used just to assemble the main styrene components and get the angles correct. And then that assembly is moved to the second part of the jig, where then the 2 different size Forstner bits are used to put these 2 curves in place. And then it's moved to the next part of the jig to put in the other 2 curves. And so the result is like this over here, and this herd of corbels being prepared for painting shows roughly how many there were. The covered waiting area was kind of an interesting project. I don't unfortunately have any real construction photos, but it had a scribed or a panel ceiling. And so I used scribed styrene for the ceiling. And then I needed more of an edge to attach the corbels. And so I added an 8 by 12-inch lip. And then the posts are also styrene, which isn't very rigid in a post application, but worked fine. These are 6 by 6 posts. And I put a metal pin in each end, and then drilled the ceiling with its, and through the lip of the ceiling and into the base of the raised floor for those pins. It ended up with a fairly rigid structure. Then I installed these, the corner trim had to go in before the corbel. So that stuff was all painted before it was installed. So I used mostly ACC rather than styrene cement. So I put in the corner trim on the first floor first, and then installed all the corbels, and then installed the spanner, which is shown in this diagram, this piece here, which then supports the rafters. So you can see the structure evolving here, lots of little pieces. And then I didn't have a real sophisticated scheme for supporting the hip roof structure. I just sort of made it up as I went, and it worked out fine. Before I finish the roof, I need to put in the chimneys, and I want to tell you about a trick I learned on chimneys too. The prototype chimney is not particularly unusual, but I couldn't find any commercial castings that were similar, and so it's just 2 full bricks wide and on a side and a square, and it's a little tapered at the top. I had no success trying to carve such a beast. I didn't really try individual bricks. I've since experimented with individual bricks for chimney, and if you have a lot of compulsive need to spend time putting things together, playing with individual bricks is an interesting possibility. I came up with the idea of a styrene stack where I took chips of styrene that were brick thickness and alternated them with chips of styrene that were a mortar thickness. I scribed the brick, half the brick scribed twice, like this model, and half of them scrabbed once in the middle, like this model. And then I just piled them together. It actually worked amazingly well. The chips for the brick courses, I used 40,000 styrene, so that's equivalent to a 2-inch thick brick. I used 11-inch as the dimensions of the length of the bricks. For the mortar space, I used 10,000 styrene, which is about a 1/2 inch in O scale. Made those chips slightly smaller than the brick course chips. Then I stacked them together, and I just did that by eye. There was no special trick involved. I just used Tester's liquid adhesive and daubed a little bit on the brick chip and slapped on the mortar chip. This shows the taper that was at the top of the chimney. And then after these chip combinations were put together, then they had to be scribed, and it's really important, regardless of what technique you use. I used a number 11 blade and several other techniques to make these scribes, and I don't think I found the right one. Anyway, you need to really hold the chips firmly because there's a lot of possibility of hurting yourself. And you need to make sure that the opposing sides of these chips have 2 scribe marks on one side, on 2 opposing sides, and then 1 scribe mark on each of the other opposing sides. And then you just glue these things together, and this is most of a finished chimney. Then I continued to the top and tapered the chips at the very top, and I actually used just chips of styrene strip for the top course so that there would be a little hole at the top of the chimney. Then I paint them boxcar red, or I've recently found that this Rust-Oleum claret wine color is a very nice brick color. Obviously, bricks come in a lot of different colors. And then I use Durham's water putty for mortar. The main thing there is to just smear the water putty on and then don't let it dry very long before you wipe it off with a damp rag. So then I installed the chimneys and applied styrene sheathing. Interestingly, on this view, these chimneys look like they are out of line. And the truth is they are out of line because they were out of line on the prototype. And I'm not certain why they were out of line. It's not like they're backed up to each other or something, but they are on a different horizontal line. Then I used styrene sheet to sheathe the roof and put pencil lines on it at appropriate spacing to guide the application of rags to riches paper shingles. These are self-adhesive shingles that I think are not been available for quite a while, but they were they're kind of like the traditional Campbell shingles in HO scale, except these are O scale. Then I applied multiple coatings. I think it was actually about 6 coats of alcohol shoe dye to get the tone of the shingles that I thought made sense. I trimmed the roof corners with wood dowel. I don't know why I used wood dowel instead of styrene rod. Styrene rod could have had a lot more flexibility about size with styrene rod. And then I made these chimney supports out of little brass strips. Turned this filial with a dowel in my drill press. These end filials were just carved from little wooden blocks, and it turned out okay. The computer printed sign was mounted in a strip wood frame, and the period has always puzzled me, but somebody tells me that that was the way things were, and the original photo shows the period after the Moclips sign. The benches were a challenge. Judy persuaded me that I needed to include a model of this prototype bench, and I thought maybe I could fabricate something from of the legs and arms from brass bar that I had on hand, but so I drew up this end view. That was my intent. But I couldn't find a way to hold these little pieces for soldering. And so I relapsed to a different strategy. I took the seat slats and mounted them on these heavier styrene support strips. And then I attached vertical brass strips to the front with ACC, and to the back I had holes drilled. You see the slats, the supports are wider than the slats, and I drilled holes in the back there where the bars could plug into, and I guess that shows pretty well on this photo. And then I had I bent these armrests from the same brass bar, and the legs I just laid out on 40,000 styrene. I drew these things scale size on my computer and glued them to the styrene, and then drilled out as much of the excess as I could, and then I carved with an X-Acto knife and smoothed with files and sanding sticks to try to get this shape. This is what I came up with. I don't honestly remember why these are blue. I don't know why I would have used blue paint for an undercoating, or why I ever thought it was going to be blue, but these are intermediate steps. The final model was, of course, green, like the trim on the station. And I'm very happy with the way it turned out, even though the technique is quite crude. And so this was the final model. I was happy to get first place and quite a few points at the PNR in 2010 here in Linwood. And then I presented it to the museum in the North Beach. I did the base, and I've had some experience with plexiglass, but for this case, I had the plexiglass case made commercially. This is the model that Jim mentioned that's in the museum at Moclips. Now, I also wanted a 1940 model for my layout, and by 1940, I wanted it to be weathered but maintained. So I had a different look in mind than the museum model. I didn't really feel confident that I could get the look I wanted with styrene, so I wanted to try something different anyway. And for some reason, I came up with the idea of trying paper. So what I did was I got this self-adhesive paper, and I printed a pattern of lines on it at the distance I needed for the spacing of the siding. Then I applied pan pastels just with a sponge. I assume by now most of you have tried some pan pastels, but anyway, these photos were actually for a subsequent project. They're not from the station, but the technique is exactly the same. Printed lines on the paper, slopped on some background gray, and then slopped on some red oxide tones. And I mean, really slop them on. You don't have to worry much about how it looks, because when you're all done, it'll be fine. This is actually one of the sheets that I used on the station. So I had stained this first with gray or black pan pastel, and then a couple of different shades of red oxide tones. And then I cut these strips. These are now self-adhesive strips. And I had first primed some scribed siding, so the spacing was going to be accurately represented. And then I just applied these adhesive strips in and over. They overlap by about a scale inch. The overall effect is pretty good. Where did I go? Oh, here, yeah, this is the one I missed. I'm sorry. So sponging on the layers of pan pastels provided the weathered appearance that I was looking for. You know, it's well maintained, but it really needs painting. And then overlapping the strips by about an inch provided some depth to the siding, so it really looks like there's something going on there. There were some other differences from the museum model. I didn't finish the rear. I'll show you in a minute, but the station on my layout is backed up close enough to a wall that there's no way anybody can see the back. And I did some dry brushing on the trim, to get the weathered appearance. I added a Grant Line order board. The roof, instead of styrene sheathing, I used plywood sheathing, and I used a different shingle too. I used Wild West Models shake shingles. And then actually the plans I mentioned earlier, the original plans included a whole page of plans for an outhouse. And so I built the outhouse. Then I weathered everything some more with pan pastels. I also added waiting room detail in this model. Details are mostly Western scale models. The chimney is just a piece of just a wood block wrapped with brick paper. The benches here, and the counter were styrene. And this is the bench end pattern that I use, so I could make more benches at some point if I wanted to. This system map on the wall in the waiting room is actually a much reduced track plan of my layout, my Moclips and Becks Creek layout. And incidentally, I kind of enjoy doing the interior details, but they're almost never very visible once you get everything in place. And so it's probably not very efficient. I also simplified the benches on the layout for my model. So I made this little jig to just make square bench legs and put them together. As you can see here, there's a bench along the back side of the open waiting area, and this is the bench that's out in the front section. You can see here though how I weathered the doors and so forth with some dry brushing. In Moclips, the station backed up. Pacific Avenue, you may remember, was the area where all the businesses were located, and it's really very close to the beach. And the station is backed up to the rear of those, or was backed up to the rear of those businesses. So these buildings back here represent that situation. And I, on my layout, wanted to model that situation. So I wanted to point out that on this drawing here, my layout wall is approximately where this red line is. I don't model the Pacific Ocean. And so I constructed these flats to represent the businesses that might be behind the station. I don't have any particular commitment to their designation, but I think this one was a general store. This one is some kind of a bar. This is obviously a hotel with a cookhouse in back. This was a apothecary, perhaps, kind of a rooming house, and sort of a hardware store, general purpose place with an apartment upstairs. And I put them together like this. These, by the way, are all basically strip wood on gator foam core in terms of construction. And so this is what I was trying to do. I wanted to capture the spirit of this 1908 prototype photo. And this is a photo from a similar perspective on my layout. These are some more scenes from the station area of my layout. A couple of canneries along the river here in the front. And this is actually what happened in reality. The Moclips station deteriorated quite a bit by the mid 20th century. I don't know the date on this photo, but it looks to me like it probably was in the 1950s, maybe 40s, maybe 60s. And this photo I took at the station in Littell, Washington, which is a similar station, but with no open waiting area. It was not in good shape in 2007. We drove by there a couple years ago and it wasn't in any better shape now. Okay, I think that takes care of it. Any questions?
Ron, I'm just blown away by your use of jigs. Boy, I hate to use the word brilliant, but I don't know what else. Those jigs are just incredibly smart and effective. Gee whiz. The clinic is worth the price of admission just to see how you manage to use jigs. Everybody's used jigs, but my God, your jigs are jigs.
Well, thank you, Jim. I use jigs a lot, partly because I'm a woodworker and I just enjoy messing around with tools and tricks. But they are very helpful.
Did you standard on muntins where there's more than one muntin, where they form a cross? In other words, one has to be cut to surround the other. Did you standardize on which way you cut, horizontal or vertical? Which one is the complete piece?
No, I didn't. And actually, mine don't cross in the sense you're talking about, I don't think. But I would do the vertical first, and I don't know why. That's just totally an arbitrary reaction, but I haven't really worked at that.
Okay. Well, you have some that do cross. Didn't you
No,
have to cut?
they don't quite cross, Jim. Let me show you.
Oh,
They're on different sashes. See, there's a sash break here.
oh, got it. Got it.
Oh, right here, the muntins are either are in layer 3. There's one muntin on this level, and there's one muntin up here. But
Yes,
they don't cross.
got
Now,
it.
they could cross. You could have a muntin across here, and I would do the vertical first.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
What was your favorite fixative glue for styrene?
Oh, for styrene, I use Tester's liquid adhesive, but for almost everything else, including sometimes for styrene and metal, I use Aleene's tacky glue. I just think it's fantastic. And I like it partly because when I make a mistake, I can take it apart and do it again.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for Ron? Excellent presentation, Ron. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I have something to say.
Uh-oh.
Ron spends many hours at these kinds of things. The thing that is most interesting to me about the whole Moclips station, two things. It was the westernmost end of the railroad at that point. The starting end was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. And the things that were taken out of the garbage can that had all of the plans for the stations, how many toilet places there would be, how many holes there would be in any toilet thing, and so forth and so on, was all available. That was saved by somebody who did a dumpster dive. And without that, this would not have happened. And Ron was really blessed to get all of this information so that he could make it as much a reality as it could possibly be. And he worked on it for a lot of years, a lot of hand wringing and so forth. And of course, I had to give him my take on things. But the Museum of the North Beach in Moclips has used this station as a fundraiser, and they are really pleased that they have Ron's first shot at it, and the second shot at it is in our basement. So, and I think you're all great that you're interested in these things. Thank you.
Thank you.
I found that one of the real good glues for adhesive styrene was just plain old MEK that you can get at one of the hardware places or something. It's rather toxic to smell and everything, but it really does do a fine job on styrene and almost welds it together. And there's really no seepage, let's say, from out of the joints or anything like that.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I haven't worked with, I primarily work with wood. I prefer wood, but I've heard that MEK is really good. I have MEK and I know how it smells, but I haven't used it for adhesive. I used it for an interesting technique to weather boxcars that Jimmy Booth
Mm-hmm.
showed at a convention one time, clinic, where you spray the thing first with dyes, with ink. You spray the boxcar with ink and then dose it with MEK to rinse most of the ink off. And it's just a really weird, but fantastic.
Is that for wooden boxcars, I hope?
No, actually, this is for plastic boxcars.
Really? It doesn't
Yeah.
melt them, huh?
Well, you don't, you use an airbrush and don't spray on water.
Oh, okay.
Hmm.
But it smells awful, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's not
you use,
good.
You use plenty of ventilation when you're using it.
Yeah.
It also is, I remember from my years at Boeing, they had these safety sheets all the time when they used MEK. It's not good to get on your skin too, because your skin, it'll actually go right into your body through your skin.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's a potential liver, so make sure you wear gloves or
Plus a
something. If you use it.
carcinogen too.
Yes. Yeah. Ron, I had a question about Moclips in general, being that was the end of the line. Did they have engine service facilities there? And
No,
no?
they had a Y. The shingle mill, the Smith shingle mill that I mentioned, was on the tail of the Y, and the station was on the base of the Y. But I
Okay.
don't think they had any engine servicing facilities. I haven't seen any evidence of water or coal or anything. But,
Okay. Interesting.
I have engine servicing facilities in Moclips now on my layout.
Rayonier had a line that terminated on the Moclips River, had a log dump there. And whether they interchanged or not, I've never known. They could have.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
They're
Rayonier was
responsible
right
for-
there.
Were they in Moclips too, Jim?
Oh, they were coming from Quinault,
Yeah.
the Lake Quinault area.
Ah,
The line out of Hoquiam that went up across the Hump Tulips and then on up to Camp 14 had a branch that went down to Moclips.
Hmm.
And
Well,
there's a gravel road there, between Moclips and Highway 101, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the old right of way.
could be. There is, as you probably know, there are still trestle pilings in the Moclips River down near the mouth of the river where the some railroad, I don't know whether it was the Northern Pacific or whether it was a local narrow gauge, ran across to the Quinault Reservation for access to cedar for the shingle mills.
Yeah. Down at Aloha, there were incredible stands of cedar down in the Aloha area, and that mill ran until not too many years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right. It
Yeah.
was gone when we first got acquainted with Moclips, but I think it was there until the 80s.
John Wayne played a Seattle detective, and you remember that, don't you? Was in
Yeah.
that chase scene between Pacific Beach and Moclips,
Yeah.
racing along the ocean shore there. Terrific. You can still drive down there if you know where that little access road is out of Pacific Beach.
Right.
The museum's got that film. If you're gonna
What was the name of that movie? Yeah, I can't think of it.
Yeah, I don't know either, but the museum has that film in their archives.
I think as a detective, his name was MC something, McGuire, McGavick, McGoo, something like that.
McGovern.
Well, it's a great scene anyway.
You all keep Ron working, will you? Keep him out of my hair.
Oh, he's got some more clinics to do for us. He just doesn't know it yet.
I have a question. So, Ron, your lovely wife kind of touched on it about people dumpster diving to get the plans, but how it's always amazed me on these clinics, even, I mean, when we had it at the bowling alley and stuff, I don't remember the name of the gentleman that did, or it's doing the Pasco yard, how he has all those plans for all the different buildings that he's doing at Pasco. But how literally did you find the plans? Was it Google
Oh.
searches? Where did you come up with the plans?
They basically were just given to me by the museum, and there were background stories about dumpster diving and that sort of thing, but I honestly don't know any of that in detail. I just got the plans from Kelly and others at the museum.
Yeah, my understanding was that things were getting cleaned out, closed down, and so forth and so on. And the plans were part of the things in Minneapolis, St. Paul area that were being thrown in the dumpster. And somebody who was aware that the plans for the stations and so forth and so on went into the dumpster, and the guy, whether he actually went into the dumpster or got the plans before they were thrown in, and they were given to the people in Moclips who had this little museum going, and it's a beautiful little museum. They've got all kinds of interesting things.
That's just amazing. Yeah, it's amazing that somebody had the foresight to take them, to keep the plans. I mean,
I think also there may be more Northern Pacific documentation on this issue that I'm not aware of, because I know that the magazine of the Northern Pacific Historical Society had an article a dozen years ago or more about this station and others, and somebody's probably got more information than I know anything.
Well, at the Burien archives, now hold the Jimmy Frederickson collection. Jimmy was an NP op, and he systematically, not dumpster dived, but attic raided just about every depot he could get to in Western and Central Washington. And that forms, that filled an entire garage. And by filled, I mean there wasn't room to walk down the aisles without knocking over piles, plus his entire basement. And that forms the substantial part of the collection at Burien now. So we owe a lot to everybody who did that sort of thing. I got into the South Tacoma NP shops about half an hour after the guys from Portland liberated all the locomotive plans. The what's the name of the society? Locomotive and Railway Historical, or they're not modelers, they're locomotive history. I liberated one W1 plan before they went out the door, but they have those. Mike O'Connell liberated most of the rolling stock plans, and he's got those someplace in his layout, except for the NP 40-foot flat cars, which I beat him to. But Burien is the place to start for everything. And then, of course, Minneapolis has the headquarters.
A lot of the Minneapolis stuff is being transferred to the PNRA in Burien.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
well,
I mentioned
Jim,
this anecdote, if you can stand it, in my clinic last month, but I needed the NP headquarters plan, the one that's in Tacoma on 7th Avenue and Pacific, that iconic building with the tower that the draftsman used to make his plans in way up above. Well, those are in file drawers, very difficult to find in St. Paul. But I found a guy who was willing to spend the time to hunt and go through drawers and unmarked file. He finally found them and made copies for me. Well, the following summer, Mary and I were up at Mount Rainier Paradise at the lodge, and there's a little ice cream shop, a deck out looking over the valley, Paradise Valley. We were having ice cream cones, and I noticed a couple of tourist guys over there, and being the chatty type, I went over and, hi, how you doing? Are you enjoying it? It was that guy. It was that guy who got me those plans. I mean, what are the odds?
so I don't remember the gentleman's name, Jim. You probably do, but he is modeling the yard in Pasco, and he found like the wife, the engineer or the architect that drew the plans, and she had all this stuff in the attic. And
Oh,
so
wow.
he was able to track her down and get the plans. I think he was doing like a coal silo, or he's doing something, but he found the plans for that. It's just amazing to me that people can, the history of doing model railroads and making it so precise to the plans. It's just,
Yes.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's the cool
Yeah.
part about model railroad.
Yeah, I
The P-
believe all the plans and stuff for Great Northern and Northern Pacific are at the Jackson Street terminal in St. Paul. It's called Jackson Street.
That's right.
Yeah, that's where they keep all those files that they have.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
They're not all there. The PNRA has a lot, like the icing platforms at Pasco. They've got
Mhm.
the complete drawing, which measures over 36 feet long.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing that they did keep all that stuff, or somebody rescued it and it did go into the files. So they're in between Burien and Jackson Street.
On the other hand, the number of widows who threw out car builder cyclopedias and locomotive cyclopedias the morning after the funeral. I could weep.
The PNRA is getting probably 1 or 2 donations a week of this kind of stuff you're talking about, Jim, where some family has realized there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah.
So they have a huge collection, and it's being scanned and digitized and put onto 3 different servers up there.
Well, all of us know a model railroader in our area who buys an old junker locomotive for $1.75, plastic, with broken pieces, and he puts it in his overcoat pocket. And actually, at the swap meet, he buys a $475 brass locomotive. But when he gets home, he pulls out.
Is that
The
you,
plastic-
Jim?
As Ron looks over his shoulder at his wife. No, you didn't hear that.
Jim, you just broke the sacred oath of model
Yeah.
railroaders
I
everywhere.
didn't mention any names.
Yeah. Man, what happened to broke?
Yeah.
Jim, the
Far be
real
it from me to mention Mike Shaw's name. I would never.
the secret is to get your wife to go look for your stuff
Yeah,
and buy
but
it for
then when
you.
she holds the sale after his funeral, she only puts a $1.75 price tag on that brass locomotive. Oh, jeez.
All right. Anybody else have anything else for Ron then?
Well, thanks,
Well,
everybody. It was
gratitude.
good fun.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, thank
Yes.
you so much.
Thank you. And
you.
yeah, you can probably press that stop recording button now,
Okay.
and we'll get that uploaded to I'll get it to Burr and get it up on the website, and